The illusion of emotional investment. You believe caring deeply gives you strength, but it quietly makes you predictable. Most people associate emotional investment with commitment, sincerity, and depth of character. It feels right to care, to attach meaning to people, situations, and outcomes. It creates a sense of involvement, a feeling that you are fully present in what is happening. But beneath that surface, something less visible begins to form. The more you invest emotionally, the more your internal state becomes tied to external variables you cannot control. What most people fail to notice is that emotional investment creates expectation. Not always consciously, but subtly and consistently. You begin to expect certain responses, certain outcomes, certain behaviors from others. And when those expectations are not met, the internal reaction is immediate. Disappointment, frustration, irritation. The reaction feels justified because the investment felt meaningful. But this is where the weakness forms, not in the caring itself, but in the dependency it creates. There is a quiet pattern in this dynamic. The more meaning you assign to something, the more influence it gains over your state of mind. A person's opinion matters more. A situation carries more weight. A small change feels larger than it actually is. What was once neutral becomes charged. And once something becomes emotionally charged, it gains the ability to disturb you. Not because it is inherently powerful, but because you have given it that power through attachment. This is rarely recognized in real time. Emotional investment feels natural, even necessary. It feels like engagement with life, but it also creates vulnerability. Because anything you are attached to can shift, change, or behave in ways you did not anticipate. And when it does, your internal stability moves with it. The disturbance does not come from the event itself, it comes from the gap between what you expected and what occurred. The realization that changes this is not about eliminating care or becoming detached from everything. It is about understanding the difference between involvement and dependency. You can participate fully in a situation without tying your internal state to its outcome. You can engage with people without needing their behavior to align with your expectations. When this distinction becomes clear, the intensity of emotional reactions begins to decrease. The mindset shift is subtle. Instead of asking how much something matters to you, you begin to observe how much control it has over you. You start to see that strong emotional attachment often leads to loss of internal control. Not immediately, but gradually. It shapes your focus, your reactions, your decisions. And once you recognize this pattern, you begin to loosen that attachment not by force, but through awareness. And from this awareness, a different identity begins to form. You are no longer someone who is easily moved by outcomes or dependent on specific responses. You engage without becoming entangled. You care without losing control. There is a quiet stability in this approach, a controlled presence that does not fluctuate with every change in the external environment. The silent advantage of emotional neutrality. The one who feels less is often the one who controls more. This idea appears counterintuitive because most people associate emotional expression with authenticity and strength. They believe that reacting, expressing, and showing how they feel is a form of control. But what remains hidden is that visible emotional movement creates a pattern that others can read. And once a pattern can be read, it can be anticipated. When it can be anticipated, it can be influenced. In most interactions, people are not only communicating through words. They are observing each other's internal responses. Subtle shifts in tone, posture, expression. These become signals. Without realizing it, individuals begin to map each other's reactions. Where tension appears, where irritation rises, where defensiveness is triggered, these signals reveal where emotional pressure works. And once that is known, influence does not need to be forced. It happens naturally through repeated patterns. The tension in this dynamic is that emotional expression feels like participation. It feels like engagement. When someone challenges you, the instinct is to respond, to correct, to assert your position. And in doing so, it feels as though you are maintaining control of the situation. But in reality, the moment you respond emotionally, you have already entered a frame that was not created by you. Your response is shaped by what was presented, not by what you chose independently. You are reacting within the structure of someone else's influence. What most people miss is that emotional neutrality removes this structure entirely. When there is no visible reaction, there is no clear signal to interpret. The usual feedback loop disappears. The interaction no longer follows predictable patterns because there is nothing to guide it. Without reaction, there is no direction for the dynamic to move in. And without direction, influence weakens. This does not mean that emotions disappear. They still arise, but they are not immediately expressed. There is a separation between internal experience and external behavior. This separation creates space. And within that space, control is maintained. You are no longer compelled to respond in the moment. You can observe, process, and decide whether a response is necessary at all. Most of the time, the urgency fades when it is not acted upon immediately. The realization that changes everything is understanding that control is not about dominating the interaction. It is about not being moved by it. When your internal state remains stable, the interaction cannot dictate your behavior. Others may attempt to shift the tone, introduce tension, or provoke a response, but without visible movement, those attempts lose their effect. The dynamic stabilizes around your presence, not around the pressure applied. The mindset shift is quiet but precise. Instead of expressing everything you feel as it arises, you begin to filter your response through awareness. You allow emotions to pass without turning them into immediate action. You stop using reaction as a default form of communication. In doing so, you remove the signals that would normally expose your internal state. And from this shift, a different identity begins to take shape. You are no longer easily interpreted through reaction. There is a controlled stillness in your presence. Others cannot easily predict how you will respond because you are not responding impulsively. This unpredictability is not confusion, it is stability. It reflects a mind that is not guided by external influence, but anchored internally. The discipline of letting go. Internally you want to detach, but something inside keeps pulling you back into reaction. Even when you understand the value of emotional control, even when you recognize that reacting weakens your position, the impulse remains. It appears suddenly, almost automatically. A comment is made, a tone is felt, a situation unfolds, and before you can fully process it, the urge to respond begins to rise. This is where the real difficulty lies, not in understanding detachment, but in applying it when it matters. What most people never fully see is that they are not reacting to the situation itself, but to the meaning they have assigned to it. The event is neutral until it is interpreted. A word, a gesture, a behavior, it only becomes emotionally charged once the mind attaches significance to it, and that significance is rarely questioned. It feels immediate and real, but in reality, it is constructed. The mind fills in intention, assumes meaning, and creates a narrative that then drives the reaction. This is why discipline changes everything, because the moment you begin to notice this process, even slightly, the intensity of the reaction begins to weaken. You start to see that what feels urgent is often just a layer of interpretation placed on top of a neutral event. The situation has not changed, but your perception of it has. And when perception shifts, emotional response follows. The tension here is internal. You feel the reaction forming, and at the same time, you recognize that acting on it will not serve you. This creates a moment of friction, a pause where two possibilities exist. One is automatic, familiar, and immediate. The other requires awareness, restraint, and a willingness to let the impulse pass without acting on it. Most people default to the first because it feels natural. But the second is where control is developed. The principle is simple but not easy. When meaning fades, emotional intensity fades with it. If you do not assign personal significance to a situation, it loses its ability to disturb you. This does not mean ignoring reality or pretending nothing happened. It means seeing the situation without attaching unnecessary interpretation to it. Without the added layer of meaning, the emotional charge cannot sustain itself. This is where mental boundaries begin to take form. Not boundaries that restrict what others can do, but boundaries that define what you allow to enter your internal state. You begin to recognize that not every external input deserves a response, and more importantly, not every input deserves to be processed emotionally. This awareness creates a form of separation. The situation exists, but it does not merge with your internal state. Over time, this practice leads to a quiet transformation. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions begin to lose their intensity. The urge to respond weakens. The need to engage emotionally decreases. What once felt personal begins to feel distant, not because you are disconnected, but because you are no longer entangled in every interpretation your mind creates. And from this, a different identity begins to form. You are no longer someone who is pulled into reaction by every shift in the environment. You do not absorb everything you encounter. You observe, you process, but you remain separate. There is a calm discipline in this state. A controlled awareness that allows you to move through situations without being internally affected by them, the freedom of an unattached mind. Imagine a version of yourself that moves through situations without needing them to go a certain way. Conversations unfold, people behave unpredictably, outcomes shift beyond your control, and yet internally, nothing is disturbed. There is no tension building beneath the surface, no quiet resistance to what is happening, no need to correct or control every detail. What once felt important begins to lose its grip, not because it has changed, but because your relationship to it has. What most people never fully understand is what happens when attachment is removed. They assume that detachment means withdrawal, distance, or lack of care. But in reality, detachment creates clarity. When you are no longer tied to specific outcomes, your perception sharpens. You begin to see situations as they are, not as you need them to be. The emotional distortion fades, and with it, the urgency to react. There is a subtle shift that occurs when you stop holding on internally. The mind no longer moves in response to every external fluctuation. It becomes steady, not through effort, but through absence of dependency. When nothing is tightly held, nothing can easily be taken away, and when nothing can be taken away, there is nothing to defend. This is where a different form of strength begins to emerge that does not rely on control over circumstances. The deeper principle here is that control is often misunderstood. Most people try to control the external world in order to feel stable internally. But this approach creates constant tension, because the external world is never fully within reach. Detachment reverses this dynamic. Instead of trying to shape everything around you, you stabilize what is within you. And once that stability becomes consistent, the need to control fades naturally. Over time, this creates a kind of psychological freedom that is difficult to disrupt. You are no longer moved by expectations, because you are no longer dependent on them. Situations can unfold in different ways without creating internal resistance. You engage when necessary, but you do not cling. You observe without needing to alter what you see. This allows you to move through complexity without carrying its weight. There is also a shift in how others perceive this state. Without visible attachment, without predictable reactions, the usual patterns of interaction no longer apply. People cannot easily influence what does not respond in expected ways. Not because you are resisting them, but because there is no internal hook for their behavior to attach to. The interaction becomes neutral, and in that neutrality, your position remains unchanged. And from this, your identity settles into something more stable. You are no longer defined by outcomes, by approval, or by external conditions. You are defined by your ability to remain steady regardless of them. The need to hold on fades, and with it, the need to protect, defend, or prove anything. And in that quiet state, one realization becomes clear without effort: what you no longer cling to no longer has the power to disturb you.